installment of What Would Kelly Make? This is the full card video, and today we're going to be talking about stamp highlighting. So of the stamps that were sent to me, I decided to use the Fresh Peony stamp set and die cut set from Stampendous. And I just wanted to show you here in the stamp set, you actually get a free stencil. So you get a positive and a negative of the images, the leaf and the flower anyway. And so that's just something that's kind of cool that's included in that set that I just wanted to let you know about. So for this version, there's a bunch of different ways to do stamp highlighting. This is just my preferred way of doing it. So I'm using a T-square ruler, and I'm actually not really using the T on it. I'm using more of my grid lines on the background mat that I have to line those up, and I'm doing it with a pencil first. In the technique video, if you watched that, I did the full square in a black pen first, and I decided that I wanted maybe just a little bit of a different look. So here I put my flower, so it's hanging over that frame, and I put it in place, and then I'm going to use some 3M Post-it note tape to mask off the center of my square or rectangle. It's not a square, it's a rectangle. I know shapes. And then I just erase the lines that were around it. I'm going to stamp the bottom and the right hand side in this fossil ink from Simon Says Stamp. It's like a warm gray color, which I really think is super pretty, and it matches the W3 or the warm grays Copic's really well. And then I'm going to remove that mask. Now you'll see in the top there that I kind of got some ink on the top of my flower. It's cool. I'm stamping the inside in black, but if you're doing two lighter inks, or you are doing the black on the outside and the gray on the inside, you'll want to be aware of something like that. So here I'm using the same 3M Post-it tape. I just cut it in half. You want to make sure you put your straight line on the inside, and then I'm going to stamp the inside of it in intense black ink from Simon Says Stamp. Just doing this, just stamping them in two different colors, will be enough to highlight a portion of your stamp. So the black will be obviously more visible. If you have any kind of gapping where your tape is, just make sure that you, like I call it the Sherry Carroll CPR method. I got up out of my chair, I made sure I had really good pressure, and I just stamped it down again. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the masks. One note about the masks. The reason that I chose the 3M tape is because it has like a coating on the outside that keeps the ink from seeping through it. Now, any kind of masking paper that I've ever used, doesn't matter what it is, the Simon masking paper, the Inkadinkado masking paper, Eclipse, this 3M Post-it tape, I've never had it soak through on the first time. I have had some of them soak through when I've stamped multiple times over it. So that's just something that you want to be aware of and make sure that your masking paper isn't going to do that. Now I've masked the entire flower so that I can do the leaves, and I'm going to do the leaves the same way. So I put that piece back down to mask the rectangle. I'm going to stamp first in the fossil color. I'm going to remove the mask in the center of the rectangle. I'm going to remask the outside frame, and then I'm going to stamp it in black. I'm going to do this for all of them so that anything that's on the outside of that frame piece is in the fossil color. Anything that's on the inside is in black. Here, I didn't realize that the very teeny tiny little tip of my middle leaf is actually sticking outside of that line. I'm not going to sweat it. I'm not doing it again. I'm already into the process. I'll show you how I fixed it when we get there. So anyway, back to the masking paper. Because it has that coating that prevents any of the ink from soaking through, it can stay wet on your masking paper for a little bit longer. So you just want to be aware of that when you're removing your mask so that you don't get inky fingers and get those little fingerprints all over the card. We've all been there. I mean, we've all ruined a card that way or had to add a extra embellishment because we had inky fingers and put them where they didn't belong. So I usually do the fossil color first. This is just because I don't have to clean the stamp in between then. Like the black is going to go over the fossil and it's no big deal. If I tried to do the fossil color after I did the black without cleaning it, it would be a big old mess. I would contaminate my ink pad. Here, I did have the paper move on me just slightly, so my leaves don't match up perfectly. But like I told you, we're already invested. I'm not doing this again. I will show you how I fix that when we get there. So I'm just going to remove all of the masking now. And you could, like I said, you could leave it just like this. In the technique video, I just did one basic layer of color on the inside of the framed piece, and it was enough for that stamp to be highlighted and it look super cool. I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to do my style of coloring, but that's just something to note that you can do. I'm going to go now back in with a Copic Safe pen. This is an EK Success journaling pen, and use that same ruler to just make those pencil lines black lines. And I did it in a thinner, I guess a thinner nib, a thinner tip, because I'm going to go back over it later once all the coloring's done. The other thing that I like to do is I like to hold my ruler in place. Make sure the side of your ruler is clean before you do this. We all think that they're clean, and then like you take a baby wipe to the side of that thing and all of a sudden you realize every black marker that you ever used ever is on the side of your ruler. So I'm just using my lightest color to just have a really structured edge is basically what I'm trying to achieve. So that when I'm adding in my shading with the W markers, that I have a very clear straight line for where I want my colors to end. I chose to do the grays first because I'm going to be coloring my flower with some reds. And if you put a lighter color, or you're trying to color something white, or here like a sepia tone, a grayed out version, you can pull the red into those lighter areas, and I didn't want to risk it. So that's why I started with the gray, even though shading is sometimes a little bit harder when you don't have anything to compare it to. So you can see me, sometimes I will pause and look to see where like those darkest shadows are going to be, so I know where to add that to. Like the petal that's right above this one, I'm only adding 2 colors to that because it's the edge of the petal and it will be the lightest. Whereas down here, I have 2 petals that are sitting on top of each other, and so I'm going to have some pretty substantial shading underneath that other petal, and especially where these 2 petals meet the base of this peony, there's going to be lots of dark color there. So the way that I color, if you've watched any of my videos before, you've definitely heard this. I start with my lightest color and I work out to my darkest color. When you hear the term Copic friendly ink, so the intense black ink from Simon Says Stamp is Copic friendly. That basically means it's not going to smudge, smear, bleed, any of those things. The regular Simon dye ink, which is what this fossil is, isn't quote unquote Copic friendly, but they do work well together because they are Copic based. Or I'm sorry, they're alcohol based, which means since Copics are alcohol based and this ink is alcohol based, it gives a softer look, which is more compatible with like a no line coloring. And I really, really love the way that they look. If you don't want your outline to be affected at all by your Copic markers, then you're going to want to use a Copic Safe ink. For me, I really loved the way it kind of softened out and gave a no line look, so I wasn't worried about it. Again, just going through out to my darkest color, one of the things that was a little bit trying for me was this particular leaf, like adding where the shading would come out from. But you can always go back in and fix it. Like, you don't have to be married to this. I'm doing the best that I can, and here's where I'm going to fix that little edge. I'm taking my W7 and just going right over the outline and then filling it in with the W5. And then when I do the shading on the leaf, I'll just make sure that I add some darker green shading to the inside frame so that makes sense. But so going back in, I'm only adding the darker color really in any areas that would be the darkest. And I'm not going to go back through and blend this out. I wanted it to be, like I said, like that no line coloring look. And I wanted there to be some definition to the flicks of color. Now that that is done, that the outside edge is done, I'm going to go in and start adding the actual colors, like how I would normally color anything else inside the frame. And right out the gate, you can see with me adding this green that I have missed an area of that leaf that should be darker. You can see it's like this little triangle. And I'm just going to go back in and fix it after I'm done. One of the things that I will caution you against, and it is difficult even for myself when doing this technique, is that you're not adding your shading from that line. You're adding the shading to the image that's behind it. That line is just something that is like something that's breaking up the color. But you don't want to add your shading from the line because you're not coloring the line, you're coloring the image underneath. And it can be very trying. And I think that is what happened to me there, that I wasn't, I was adding some darker color, maybe where it wouldn't go because I was paying so much attention to that line. Here, I'm going to start doing this, but then I'm going to stop and I'm going to give myself, again, that same kind of barrier that I did in the beginning with the W1 on the outside. I'm going to give myself a little bit of a barrier with the green marker as well, just a very light little straight line. So this way I know where to stop my coloring so that it doesn't bleed over, and it has a very clear delineation between the outside of the frame and the inside of the frame. This is a lot easier to do if you carry that black line all the way across, but I didn't want to cut off the image. When I did the technique video and showed that, I just ultimately didn't really love the way that it looked, so that's why I decided to change it up. Either one would be okay. And like I said at the beginning of the video, there's a ton of different ways to do stamp highlighting. So for this one, I did the frame. You could skip the frame altogether and maybe leave your leaves, like the sepia color, and just color the bloom. Or you could color it this way and then die cut out the middle and pop that up. So there's just like a ton of different ways that you can approach this. This is just my preferred method because I like one layer cards. I mean, that's really ultimately what it comes down to. So I chose a little bit of a different combination for the reds that I'm going to be using here. Typically, my go-to red combination is a R32, an R35, an R29, and an R59. I did not want this to feel like Christmas. That's basically what happened. I struggle with that. Anything to me in my head, red and green, is Christmas. I know that is not true, but I can't help it. That's just the way that I view it. So I decided that I was going to go for more of a peachy red. And so here what I'm doing, these flowers, first of all, are huge, and they are great to practice your coloring because larger images are so much easier to color than smaller images, especially if you're practicing your flicking, your shading. These are great, and the stamp's beautiful. So what I'm doing is I'm going in with my lightest color and I'm mapping out where I want my darkest parts to be. Again, you're shading the flower as if that line isn't there, but in the same token, you need to pay a little bit of attention to it because you don't want to go over that line to the grayed out area. So once I have the first color down, I'm going to go back in and just start building out my colors. So I'm working out towards the darkest color. Each time I'm not completely covering up the color before it, but I am, coming probably right up to the line. I prefer to color leaving a very, very large highlight the first time through because I am typically heavy-handed. And if I start, with my darker colors, then I don't have a highlight at all by the time that I'm done. That might not be the way that you color. You might need to start with your darker color in order to be able to preserve your highlight just because of the way you add shading. There isn't a right or a wrong way to do this, folks. And I hope that when you watch this, you can see maybe how you can apply it to your own cards. It might be a little bit different for you. Maybe you only like a 2-color blend or, a 3-color blend. I use 4. That's just where I'm comfortable at, and how I feel like I get the best depth. But if you watch the technique video, I did this same style of card and I just filled them in, like I said before, with just one layer of color. And because of the technique, because how one portion of it is, grayed out and one portion has the really bright color, the technique on its own makes the card pop. You don't have to do tons of fancy coloring. This is just how I prefer to add my shading, how I prefer to color. And when I'm doing smaller images, I'm using, just the tip of the marker and then doing very light-handed flicking strokes. Because this is so big, I'm really using more of the side of the marker because there's just so much more area to cover. So each time I am not, when I'm coming up to that grayed out portion, I'm not shading what I need to be shading. It's a double negative. But I am being very, very conscious about how the shading should look or sit, as far as how far out it should go. And so sometimes you'll see me kind of pause and look at how that's going to be. I'm not really stressing out about it at this point because I know I'm going to go back over this. And here I am out to the darkest color, and I'm just pretty much just adding a line to most of these petals, just around the areas where one petal sits on top of another. If there is a larger surface area, I will do some small flicks of color. There's that one petal that I just did where basically the only part of it you can see is just like the tip of it. All of that's going to be dark down the center of it because it is so within the rest of the flower. But for the petals that are curling over, I'm adding just a little bit of shading into kind of like the wavy areas. And then with reds, sometimes it can be a little hard to get shading when you're trying, like you don't want it to be too orange or you don't want it to be too like maroon. So to get the deepest, darkest shading, I'm actually using the W5. So I colored the outside with the W's, and now I'm going into the darkest parts with the W5 to add the shading. I'm going to be going back over this with my same red colors, so I'm not worried about it looking quote unquote gray, but I'm just using it to add some depth. So you can do this, you can do the gray shading with anything you have going on. And if you have minimal amounts of Copic markers, I would highly recommend getting the warm grays and the cool grays, because you can add shading to your images with that and then go over it with the maybe minimal amounts of actual colors that you own and still be really happy with the way that the shading looks. So now that I'm going back, heading towards the lightest color again, I am flicking that color even further out. And then, back out to this R02. The R00, and this part always goes by like so much faster because I've already done all of the hard work, all of the mapping and where the color should go. And now I'm just filling it in. For the R00, basically what I'm doing with that, which is my lightest color, I'm just going to use it to kind of like pre-moisten the paper so that I get good blending, because if you noticed when I showed you originally the colors I was using, there is a Y000 in there. And I just thought that it would be fun to kind of break up the color a little bit after, like, so here I am, I'm going to fill it in the tips with just the lightest color, this R00. And then I just thought the yellow would be kind of fun to break it up a little bit and to maybe pull myself away from that little bit of Christmas feeling I might have about the red flower, green leaves. And that's pretty much all the color I have on there. I have another little trick for how I'm going to break that up later on. Talk about that when we get there. So just kind of filling this in, again, being careful not to go over that line to the outside. And then I'm just going to take this Y quadruple 0, and I'm just going to go in on the tips and flick it towards the base of the petals. This isn't going to add a whole lot of color, but it is going to add a little bit to make the flower look, more two-toned, so that it's, more red towards the base and then yellow as it grows out towards the tips. I love doing this because, basically you just do all the shading with your one color family, and then you can just add a little bit of another color to get a totally different look. for the like the center stamens of the flowers, I'm using some more yellows. These you could probably shade with just 2 colors, but I wanted it to match the richness that I had already achieved in the flower. I didn't want it to look flat. So I am adding a little bit of shading with a YR24 and a Y08, just to make them a little bit brighter and a little bit more dimensional. The last color I'm using is the Y02. From here, I'm going to go in and start looking at if I had any bleeding or if I have any areas that need to be cleaned up in the outside edges. I'm being very careful to make sure that I don't blend like out the red, but I did have some areas where the red did kind of bleed out a little bit and I needed to clean that up. The other way I'm going to break this up and make it feel less Christmassy to me is by adding a little bit of color in the background. Now, again, all of the color is only in the inside rectangle because I want to highlight that portion of the stamp, but I am outlining it in a medium bright blue-green color. It's the BG13. And then I want this to kind of blend out to the white. So when I go in with the next color, I am flicking out toward the white, but I'm completely covering that first blue line because I don't want a hard edge. I want to be able to break that up so that it does look soft. When I do the last color, which is the BG quadruple 0, I'm doing the same thing. I'm taking it all the way back to the base of the flower, to that very first line, to help it to break up to be a little bit smoother out into the white. Here's where I'm going to go back in now that everything is colored. I know I'm going to outline my image on the inside with the black pen. That's just how I roll. I like a bold black outline. But I wanted to make sure that I was happy with the width of the line on the outside and that it was solid black. So I went in with a bigger nib. I think this is a 45. And just re-outlined those. And then I'm going to go in and outline the whole flower. These are some very thick lines. So you want to make sure that you have a pen that's going to at least be somewhat equivalent to that. I'm going to add a couple of white highlights on the stamen that are coming out, the black ones from the center of the flower. Then I'm going to start working on the sentiment. So this was a struggle for me. Like, I'll just be honest, it was. I really liked the different shapes that were available, but I couldn't find something that was going to work for the card layout that I chose. That was my own fault. I should have picked a different card design, but nonetheless, here we are, we're making it work. So I cut this out of Simon Says Stamp Black cardstock, and I wanted to add some detail to make it a little bit more interesting. So I fit it back into the die, and then I traced the inside edge with my white gel pen, and this kind of gives it like a chalkboard-ish feel. It just felt more finished to me. It looked nicer to me, I guess. I'm going to do some white heat embossing for my sentiment. I'm treating that with my anti-static bag, and then I'm going to stamp in Versamark ink. This says Best Wishes, and so I'm going to stamp it at the bottom. If you have any issues as like with white heat embossing where you have some areas, maybe you got some embossing powder that you didn't want it, or you have some embossing powder that wasn't I guess, as opaque as you want it, there's a couple of ways to fix that. You can fix the black by just going in with like a Copic pen or even that EK Success journaling pen. Once everything, that's what I'm doing now, melting it down so that it's all smooth and heat set. But you can go in with a black pen and kind of fix those, or you can use your white gel pen to fix any areas where maybe your embossing doesn't look exactly like you wanted it to look. I popped this up on some foam tape and I added it to the top of my card. I'm going to trim off the excess just from the top. And then I decided it needed, like some of those areas needed to be filled in on the sentiment. And I'm going to do that with some, I think it's Simply White. Yeah, Simply White Nuvo drops. And I like to use sequins as a placeholder so I know where I want to put my drops. And so I'm happy with their placement. But here's the thing. I thought I was done and I'm not because I don't love it. I don't. And so I'm going to fix it. So I actually pulled off the sentiment and I did pull my paper a little bit And I'm going to show you how I fix that. First, I went in, sometimes just a regular eraser is enough to kind of smooth it down. So I'd always try that first. This time it wasn't. I had to go in with the sanding eraser, but this totally worked. You know, it smoothed it out. There was a little bit of color that pulled up. So I'm just going to go back in with that same BG quadruple zero and fill that back in so that everything's the same color. And then I chose a different sentiment from that same set. It says thinking of you, and I'm using the other side, the part that I cut off. So I didn't have to do a new one. I just had to heat set a new sentiment. And this time I put it off to the left-hand side, and I just liked this placement so much better. It just felt more balanced to me. And then instead of using the white Nuvo drops, I'm actually just going to use some clear sequins. I felt like, I don't know, the white was kind of distracting from the sentiment. So I'm putting that down with some glossy accents, and then I always like to fill the sequins with just a little drop of glossy accents so I know that they aren't going to come off. Somehow, when I did it the first time, I missed putting down this clear Wink of Stella. I don't know why. Apparently, I wanted my card recipient to be sad because they had no glitter in their life. And then that is the whole card. So I hope that one element of this will be inspiring to you so that you can maybe try stamp highlighting. And I will catch you guys next month for the next video. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I'll see you then. Bye.